Well, hello, friends. Thank you so much for joining me for another episode of Reading Michael Jackson. I am your host, Lena, and I'm thrilled to be back here with you again today. I've got it mixed up. I can't always say I'm happy. I have to sometimes say something else. So look for that the next few weeks. Just a variety of synonyms. I am very happy, though, to be here with you today. We are, of course, continuing our read of Dancing the Dream. With that, we are on episode 32, which means we have less than 15 pieces left to read until we have completed this book, which is wild to me. I feel like I've been reading this book for my whole life. If only I had been, who would I be? Anyway, so today we are reading a piece which is a bit more of like a traditional essay, you could say. So I don't want to say it's a short story, but we'll see. I haven't read this in a while, actually, but it is a piece that I'm looking forward to seeing what it's about. So with that said, get comfortable and get cozy and join me for this reading of Wise Little Girl. Wise Little Girl. I know a wise little girl who cannot walk. She is confined to a wheelchair, and she may spend the rest of her life there, since her doctors hold out almost no hope of ever making her paralyzed legs better. When I first met this little girl, she flashed me a smile that burned me with its blazing happiness. How open she was. She wasn't hiding out from self-pity or asking for approval or protecting herself from a sense of shame. She felt completely innocent about not being able to walk, like a puppy that has no idea if it's a mongrel or a champion of the breed. She made no judgments about herself. That was her wisdom. I've seen the same wise look in other children, poor children as society sees them, because they lack food, money, secure homes, or healthy bodies. By the time they reach a certain age, many of these children grasp just how bad their situation is. The way that adults look at their lives robs them of that first innocence that is so precious and so rare. They begin to believe that they should feel bad about themselves, that this is right. But this wise little girl, being only 4, floated above pity and shame like a carefree sparrow. She took my heart in her hands and made it as weightless as a cotton puff, so that it was impossible for me to even begin to think, what a terrible thing. All I saw was light and love. In their innocence, very young children know themselves to be light and love. If we will allow them, they can teach us to see ourselves the same way. One sparkle from a little girl's gaze contains the same knowledge that nature implants at the heart of every life form. It is life's silent secret, not to be put into words. It just knows. It knows peace and how not to hurt. It knows that even the last breath is a gesture of gratitude to the Creator. It smiles to be alive, waiting patiently for ages of ignorance and sorrow to pass away like a mirage. I see this knowledge showing itself in the eyes of children more and more, which makes me think that their innocence is growing stronger. They are going to disarm us adults, and that will be enough to disarm the world. They feel no reason to spoil the environment, And so the environment will be cleaned up without a quarrel. A wise little girl told me the future when she looked at me, so full of peace and contentment. I rejoice in trusting her above all the experts. As light and love drive away our guilt and shame, her prophecy must come true. Okay, well, now that I have reread this piece, I'm actually a little surprised I didn't remember it better. I really liked this piece a lot. I love the story he tells. This is one of the more straightforward pieces where Michael is talking about children, where he's talking specifically not just about this general childhood innocence, but he's talking about how miraculous it is for adults to witness in children such an innocence that transcends even their personal circumstances and the challenges that they are facing. In this story, the little girl is a little girl that is in a wheelchair, and she's only 4 years old, and there's not an outlook at this point about whether or not she will walk. And as he says, when we look at that, we feel a sense of real gravity and sadness about that situation. But the little girl doesn't. The little girl doesn't know yet to feel that way. And I want to say something about that. And there's a lot I want to say about this piece in the episode, but I don't want to forget this part. Michael is admiring the lack of shame and self-pity this little girl has. And it's a beautiful thing to be able to see that sparkle of joy in her eye and to embrace that kind of innocence in her and to find inspiration in that. But something I would want to ask Michael, if I could talk to him, is where do you think that assumption we have that someone would feel a sense of shame might come from? Or where does our own sense of pity really come from? And I'd be really curious to know what his answer is to that question, because as I was reading this, I was thinking about accessibility and how one of the reasons many able-bodied people feel a sense of sadness or sorrow for people who are not able-bodied, and in this case, especially a child who is in a wheelchair, part of the reason is because we know the world. And we know how difficult the world is in its current makeup and how it is set up for anyone who experiences the world differently. You know, we know that the world is set up only for those of us who are able-bodied and healthy and who do not need more accessible accommodations. And so we can look at a little girl in a wheelchair and we can know her life is going to be challenging because we know that as most societies and cultures, there's a limitation as to what we really do to make someone's life easier who is in those circumstances. And that comes down to things like accessibility and the importance of making things accessible and valuing accessibility as a tenet of the way we run our society. If we set up society so that life did not just cater to those people who are able-bodied, then we wouldn't have to worry as much about those people who are not. Does that make sense? So you can't answer, so I don't know. So I was thinking about that while reading this and thinking about where does a person's sense of pity and sorrow come from? And this is not to question if that's a valid or reasonable response to seeing a child in a really difficult physical circumstance. Obviously, I think that is most people's response to seeing a child who we perceive as suffering in some way. But it's interesting to think about, where does that perception come from? And could there be a world in which, by easing the struggles that a person faces, we then can by and large ease the pity that we feel? Because no one wants to be pitied. No one wants to be looked at like, oh, I feel sorry for them. Nobody wants that. So I don't know. That's its own topic, but I didn't want to forget it, because I think in a conversation about a little girl like this who has a disability, and in general, this conversation that we're going to have about Michael and children, and the children that he most spent time with and tried to help, I just think it's important to recognize that like part of the makeup of the challenge is the world that we are all a part of. So with all of that said, let's talk more about the content of this piece. I mean, as I read this, I couldn't help but wonder at first, like, who is the little girl that Michael's referring to? He says he met this little girl and she flashed me a smile that burned me with its blazing happiness. I mean, if I were a little girl, I would be smiling at Michael like that too. I'm just saying. But in all seriousness, he says this, and I immediately wondered where he met that little girl, because of course I'm thinking about the footage we have of Michael in the very many trips he made to hospitals and orphanages and all the different places in which he visited children. And I thought of one of my favorite clips in the world, which is when in 1985, he visited Australia for the telethon for children, and they interview him, and it's just, oh my God, it's so adorable. The whole interview is adorable. But in that, he is introduced to a little girl in a wheelchair and a little boy who's on crutches, and they give him a gift and thank him for coming to the telethon. And it's this beautiful exchange, this very cute moment. And I am instantly thought of that just because, the content of this. So I think one of the really lovely things about reading a piece like this is that as fans of Michael, we know he spent a tremendous amount of time with kids who were underprivileged in different ways, but he had a special place in his heart for children who were sick, who were disabled, who had any kind of physical struggles that they were up against that kept them, in some ways, from leading a normal childhood. We know he had tremendous passion and dedication to those children. I've often wondered if it was difficult for Michael to go to these hospitals, to these orphanages, to see children in cancer wards and being treated for horrible diseases, for burns, for all kinds of things. I wonder, how did he manage that emotionally? How did he handle that? Because obviously it was rewarding for him. But I wonder still, he's a human being, and he was a deeply sensitive human being, as we know. How did he handle that? And so this is a little bit of an insight into how he handled it. He wasn't immune to being in these circumstances and seeing kids in these situations. He felt that sense of sorrow. He struggled with that, but he existed in the moment, in the time and place of their innocence and their happiness, and he embraced that part of them. He didn't see them for their disability or for their illness. He saw them for their innocence and their childlikeness, and that's what he appreciated. That's where his focus was. And it kind of makes me wonder about how we can all apply that to our own lives. When we see anyone who is struggling, it doesn't matter what the struggle is, or if they're adults or children or whatever. If we could try to see through the struggle, instead see the person and what they're kind of shining out. In this case, for her, this blazing happiness, as he called it, and this innocence of not realizing that she was different, focusing in and making and paying attention to that exceptionality that everyone has if we look for it. I don't know. I thought that was really sweet and inspirational to me. And it also, just generally this topic makes me think about Michael Jackson's relationship to service. He was a service-oriented person. And when I say service, I mean service to humanity, service to the greater good beyond himself. First of all, I will never forget learning about his humanitarian nature. As I said this recently in another episode, before becoming a Michael Jackson fan, I had no idea anything that he stood for. I had no idea. And when I learned that he donated $500 million, a rough estimate throughout his life, that he donated full revenues from concerts to charitable organizations. It blew my mind, and it still blows my mind, because who does that? Like, who does that? But Michael Jackson did that. And so when I learned that, it blew my mind. And then I discovered that there are people in the fandom who feel the same way I do, who one of their primary interests in Michael was the role he played in the world and what he wanted to achieve and how he gave back and the messages he was trying to send through his humanitarian work. There are a ton of fans that's their primary attraction to him as an artist. In fact, if you are not familiar with Paul Dwyer, who is an Australian Michael Jackson fan, who has dedicated a tremendous amount of his time, his resources, and creative efforts into commemorating Michael Jackson's humanitarian work, he has created 3 different avenues for you to educate yourself and explore these aspects of his life. So I believe first was the documentary, which you can see on YouTube. It's called Michael Jackson Humanitarian. And this documentary covers Michael's humanitarian work from his entire life, from the time he was a child up until the end of his life. And there's footage of things and interviews. And it's really this beautiful compilation of footage and information about Michael that really tells the story of the ongoing legacy of his humanitarian focus. After that, he published a book, Humanitarian, The Real Michael Jackson. And this book is formatted almost like a timeline throughout Michael's life, following the various places he went and things he did, and really giving context for some videos and footage and things that we can see elsewhere. And then there's his podcast. And in this podcast, he interviews people who had some kind of a connection to Michael and his humanitarian work. So there's interviews with people who met Michael when they were children and they were in the Make-A-Wish program, or they got to go to Neverland at some point, or they worked for Michael and they helped put together programming that Michael funded and supported. There are so many stories, and these are some of the best pieces in the fan community that have been made. But I really hope that at some point the Michael Jackson estate really embraces that this is a massive part of Michael Jackson's legacy. But that's a whole separate topic. To keep to this piece, I did just want to shout out Paul Dwyer's work, because if you are not familiar with it, I highly recommend it. And I will put links in the description of this episode for you to check out. With that said, though, let's continue with this piece, because this is not a piece that is just about Michael visited children's hospitals and Michael supported kids. This is a piece that's ultimately about survival, resilience, and hope. And in a lot of ways, it's also a piece about self-esteem and self-worth in a society that can easily dismantle both of those things within you. He says he admired in her that she made no judgments about herself. That was her wisdom. And I love that someone like Michael can recognize that as wisdom, because it's really easy to look at Michael and know what he had gone through and even hear his own words about his own struggles and insecurities, and to know that he judged himself very harshly. He was very hard on himself. And he clearly admired the ability to not do that. And I wonder if he had put together that in his own inability to stop from judging himself, he was reflecting the world that had created that sense of shame within him. Whereas this little girl, still young enough, still pure enough, she's still protected from the eventual judgments that would come at her from the world. He says, I've seen the same wise look in other children, poor children. He puts the word poor in quotation marks here, as society sees them. He goes on to mention poor because they lack food, money, secure homes, or healthy bodies. So in a sense, by putting the word poor in quotation marks, he's saying, society is the one saying this. This is society's dialogue about these people. And by doing that, He's reminding us again that when you look at people through that lens of what they are, like the way you see them, and you look down on them in that way, even if it's from a place of love, you are dehumanizing them in some way. You know, when you look at someone as poor children, when you look at these children as poor children, that's all they become to you. You don't think about the nuances of who they are. You don't think about each of their individual names and individual needs that are or are not being met in different ways. You're thinking about them as this mass, and they become that adjective. They become, as a human being, poor or sick or disadvantaged, and that's all they are to you then. And that's okay to generate a sense of compassion to some degree, but it's not necessarily the most helpful either. Because ultimately, we really need to see people as full people in order to be motivated to really help them, right? He says, the way the adults look at their lives robs them of the first innocence that is so precious and rare. They begin to believe that they should feel bad about themselves, that this is right. This is a really important point, I think. He's talking about how the way that others view us becomes the way we view ourselves, or it can become the way we view ourselves. And those narratives, like have you ever been really happy about something, or even okay with it? You know, like you're happy with your haircut, or you're okay with your haircut. You're good either way about your haircut. But then somebody else comes up to you and says, God, what happened to your hair? Or, oh, are you upset about it still? And you're like, what? And they're like, your haircut. No, I'm making light of it. But what I mean is that situation in which a person's commentary on you changes how you feel. I mean, you're fine with something, or you can manage something okay, or you don't think of yourself in a certain way. And then other people look at you with pity and it changes things. That's part of why we don't like to be pitied, I think, is we have a sense of pride in who we are. Intrinsically, we have pride in who we are. It is the world around us that makes us think that we are undeserving of that pride, or wrong to have such pride, or even positivity about ourselves. And then if you are a person who is positive and happy and endures and resilient, then people look at you as if you are some inspiration, again, pedestalizing you. So you're still not just you, so it's a complicated thing. And I think he's touching upon that really beautifully here. But he says that she floated above pity and shame like a carefree sparrow. And one of my favorite lines, simply because it is so, so cute, he says, she took my heart in her hands and made it as weightless as a cotton puff, so that it was impossible for me to even begin to think, what a terrible thing. I love this line. It's so cute, first of all. She took my heart like a cotton puff. I just love that image. It's very sweet. But I really like this line because, again, this reinforces this idea of why he did this. Obviously, it was because he loved and cared and wanted to give back, but he got something from this, something that he really desperately needed in his life. Michael had a hard life and a lot of reasons to have doubt in the goodness of the world. But being around children like this, being reminded of that type of carefree joyousness of life and existence that was possible, and this sense of self and beauty and all the things he's seeing in this moment with this little girl, I think that reinvigorated him in a way that nothing else really could. Because it wasn't about him. It's not like when he went on stage and his fans' energy reinvigorated him. Of course it did, but that was about an exchange between them. In this case, he was seeing this little girl or seeing these children, and he was able to feel and see the world differently as a result of it. And everyone needs something like that in life. Something that is grounding, that helps you see things differently and makes you want to be better. And I think this probably was that for Michael, which is pretty amazing if you think about it. He says, one sparkle from that little girl's gaze contains the same knowledge that nature implants at the heart of every life form. And this knowledge is to know peace and not to hurt. To know that even the last breath is a breath of gratitude toward the Creator. And I understand these words to mean it's a sense of presence and gratitude for life, for appreciating exactly as it is, exactly as it's been given to us, for showing up, not with self-pity, but self-respect, for being gracious in the presence of others. I think Michael's being able to take in this moment in that way speaks to that in him too. So this makes a lot of sense to me. But then we get to the end, which I think is very interesting because he talks about how he feels so much hope in children. He says he thinks their innocence is growing. And I wonder if he meant by that, like when he looks at children today versus children, when he was a kid, if he's seeing that as time passes, the children of the world are becoming more and more innocent. Because I was a little confused by the ending. He says, they are going to disarm us adults, and that will be enough to disarm the world. They feel no reason to spoil the environment, and so the environment will clean up. And he goes on to say, I rejoice in trusting her above all experts. And I want to clarify this and the reasons that threw me a little bit. For one, I think what he's saying is real. Like the philosophy, if you look at the way children view the world and try to adapt that as a philosophy, then that as a prophecy of like light and happiness and love and gratitude should be something that could be harnessed for the world. But here's the thing, when he talks about children growing more innocent and he talks about we're not going to poison our environment or whatever. Was he referring to these children when they grow up? Because there's such innocence there, when they grow up, they're going to kind of fix things? Or was he saying that as time passes, the kids from the 1990s versus the kids from the 2020s, the kids from the 2020s have greater innocence, and that will be even more disarming to the parents of those children and make bigger changes for the parents or the adults around them. I just wasn't clear about that, but it made me a little sad too, because it made me think about how kids and mostly do end up losing this kind of innocence at some point. The product of being a person, being alive in this world in which so much is taken from you when you're little. That innocence is increasingly lost as you get older. So it made me sad. Like, what did Michael see as the end game here? Did he actually see a time in which people would be able to harness and hold on to that enough so that by the time they reached adulthood, they would be able to, with some adult power, make changes in the world, harnessing their childhood innocence? Is that what he perceived would happen? Or does he just assume that eventually adults exposed to childhood innocence will be so affected by it that they will do something? I was a little uncertain. But one thing I thought about, because my first thought was sort of like, oh, Michael, that's such a beautiful, idealistic thought, but like, I don't know, But then I had this thought occur to me that in the 2020s, now I'm not saying this originated in the 2020s, but it certainly is present now. In the 2020s, there's been, because of social media, more and more people talking about healing your inner child. Now, I know this concept is very old. I'm not saying it's not. But in terms of becoming almost a common knowledge talking point, the importance of healing child wounds and parenting yourself and nurturing that part of yourself and all those things, those beliefs have been around for a long time, sure. But there's an active movement online about this. I mean, there's people who regularly talk about this now. There's books about it now. It's a popular way of viewing life now. I've actually had students in the past write about this topic and how embracing your childlike wonder is part of healing your inner child, and how adults today are encouraged more to, collect things from when they were children, to hold on to and foster that part of themselves still, to not force themselves to grow up as quickly. And that is true. I mean, that is a changing dialogue, where when Michael was in his late 20s and his 30s, he was considered weird for liking childlike things and for enjoying that. And he would talk openly, I'm compensating, I'm trying to reconnect with that part of myself. He talks about that in this book, and people viewed that as weird. But today we have people who collect Funko Pops. We have people who play video games at all ages, and that's normal. We have adults who actively try to heal before they have children and going to therapy and trying to heal themselves before they have children. Like, there's definitely a sense of people trying to heal themselves and trying to reconnect with who they were as children. I mean, that is absolutely, unquestionably a movement right now that is very popular, at least in the United States. So that made me think maybe Michael was onto something when he said this. Because the way he writes it here, I'm like, I don't know, Michael. The world is not doing so great right now. But if we were to think about it as embracing that inner child part of ourselves, embracing the lessons that this little girl and our own little child self inside of us could teach us, how would that result potentially in what he was talking about here? I think this is a fascinating piece, and I really like it. I really felt moved by it, imagining Michael in this scenario and imagining his reflections here. So I hope that you enjoyed hearing this too, and that some of this commentary resonated as well. So I want to thank you for once again taking the time to listen to this podcast. If you have time and interest, I strongly suggest checking out Paul Dwyer's Michael Jackson Humanitarian film on YouTube, or his podcast, if not also his book. They are really phenomenal pieces that really speak, I think, to giving a greater context for Michael's experiences like the one that he has here. So once again, thank you so much for your time and for showing up today for this conversation. I really enjoyed it, and I look forward to speaking with you again soon. In the meantime, have a wonderful week, weekend, and take care.